Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, yes. That's important. If my English is not clear enough, please raise your hand and then we will discuss until you understand it, you know?
And you say in Hungarian, yes.
What?
And you will say in Hungarian.
Yes. So, thank you very much, especially for Laszlo, thank you very much. Laszlo, so Clientele, Guus just told it, is an international networking organization, and in many countries we have like a Clientele ambassador, and Laszlo is our Clientele ambassador, and I have to say he is the most active ambassador we have in the world. That's really true, and so thank you for that. That means that when we publish something that is interesting, then Laszlo, within 1 day or 2 days, he translates it into Hungarian. So on the Clientele website, we also have a Hungarian page. And you can find at least some articles, most of them translated by Laszlo. And this is very helpful. I think this is the future. If Clientele wants to be successful, like Guus is always very like, oh, we are going to conquer the world. I'm always a little bit more modest. But he is correct that if we want to conquer the world, then we need lots of very active people around the world who spread our message. Of course, only when they agree with it. Yeah, that's of course. We are all scientists. By the way, my own background, I studied chemistry. And after that, I became a science journalist. So I've been working as a science journalist for 25 years, and for the last 20 years, I have specialized myself in the climate debate. So I have been writing about climate for the last 20 years. And that means, some people say, in Holland, some people will say, oh, Marcel, you're only a journalist. You're only a journalist. You're not a scientist, so you cannot really debate with us. I say, because I'm a journalist, I have a big advantage. Because as a journalist, you can interview, most of you are scientists, I suppose. Yeah. As a journalist, I can come to you as a scientist and I can say, I want to have an interview with you, and I want to interview with so I can interview many different climate scientists with different views, you know, and then I can make up my own mind. While most scientists are specialists. So you have a climate scientist who is a specialist in glaciers or tree rings or climate models or whatever. But I have a much broader picture. I can really look around and say, okay, what is most important? What is the most important aspect of the climate debate for society or for the politicians? Yeah? Because we want to know. The IPCC claims there is a big climate crisis. So we want to know, is this true? And on what is it based? And those are the questions that I, as a journalist, can ask every day, of course. So, well, Guus already explained that he and we founded Clientele 5 years ago. And so at the time I was already, for 15 years, I was like, the most outspoken critic, I have to say, in the Netherlands about this topic. And then there was a sponsor, and he said, the other view on climate also needs support. Because you have to realize that also in the Netherlands, that all the money, all the climate money is going to the mainstream narrative. Yeah, the mainstream IPCC narrative. All the money, like just everything. And I often say that I'm not retired yet, I'm 53, so I started when I was like 35, 33, and so I have to make a living. I have a wife, I have 2 kids, so I have to make a living. I am the only person, I would say, I'm the only person in the Netherlands who try to have a job from being critical about climate. The only one. All the other people, there are more people in Holland skeptical or critical about this issue, but they are, most of the time, they are retired, or they have another job in another field, you know. I am literally the only one who has to make a living of this, like, this founded criticism. Because of course it's not like just being like, we are not political. I have to also to say, we are not political, we are like a think tank, And I heard about MCC, it's a Hungarian think tank. I'm very excited about them because they are now also active in Brussels, and I went to several meetings of them, and wow, this is amazing. This is the first think tank in Brussels that has really interesting views and interesting topics. It's led by Frank Furedi, Hungarian, I heard. He's a Hungarian sociologist. And so this is really encouraging that they are now active in Brussels. So, and Guus also explained that we have this World Climate Declaration. You can read it in Hungarian on our website. The main message is there is no climate emergency. And I just want to mention this, that last year John Clauser, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022. He joined this declaration. And this kind of thing is very, very important, because if scientists with this status say, okay, I agree with Clintel, I agree that there is no climate emergency, that gives a big signal to the world, you know. And we noticed that many more scientists wanted to join our declaration. It's not, you don't have to be only a climate scientist. You can be like, we have a lot of energy experts like Laszlo, we have a lot of engineers who work in the energy business or in the energy industry, because they see what's going on in climate policy and they disagree with the climate policy. Yeah? So take a look at our website. Okay, but today my focus will be on this book that we published last year. And in this book we look at the latest IPCC report. Is everybody, by the way, is everybody familiar with the IPCC? You all know what IPCC is. Is there anybody who worked for IPCC, who contributed to IPCC, who contributed to one of their reports, was expert reviewer? No. Okay. So you're, in that sense, you're quite neutral. You're outside the system. Okay. Before I want to delve into the AR6, the sixth assessment report that was published a few years ago and that we analyzed, I want to give you a short overview, because yeah, I think it's good to know where did IPCC come from and what can we say about some of the other reports. So the IPCC was founded in 1988 by all the countries in the world, more or less, just like the United Nations. Officially it falls under both the United Nations and also under the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. So they are the founders of the IPCC. Well, their goal is very simple. Of course, the politicians around the world, they hear that there is some climate problem and they want to know from scientists, what is the status? What is the status of the climate? Yeah? What can you say us? What can you tell us about the climate? So this is actually what the IPCC is doing. Some people believe that IPCC is all about money, but in my opinion, although I'm very critical about IPCC, this is not true. The money involved in IPCC is very limited, because the scientists who work on the IPCC reports officially have to do it in their own time. In practice, this is also not true, because, for example, you have like a National Climate Institute here. We have one in the Netherlands, it's called KNMI. And if somebody from KNMI works on the IPCC report, his boss, his or her boss, will say, oh, we think it's very important that you work on IPCC, so you are allowed to work on IPCC in our time, you know, in your office hours. And this is, of course, and these people work for universities, government institutes, so in practice the countries are paying the scientists to work on the IPCC reports. They publish reports, like the first one was only 200 pages, but now they publish reports like several thousand pages long. It's amazing, yeah? 3,000 you say? 4,000, because the report is in 4 parts. You have working group 1, that's what you normally would say is the natural science. It's about physics and meteorology and climate, you know. But then you have the working group 2, it's about impacts of climate change. Then you have working group 3. It's about policy response, adaptation and mitigation. And then you have the synthesis report, which is the synthesis of the other 3 reports. Altogether, you probably write 4,000 pages now. And it's quite unreadable, so it's a lot of technical terminology, and I think very few people will read the whole report. Most scientists will read some parts of the report that they are specialized in. Okay, well, let's go to the first report that was published in 1990. And this will surprise maybe some people, but in the first report, the main conclusion was, yes, there is some warming, but the size of the warming is consistent with prediction of climate models, but it is also of the same magnitude as natural climate variability. So in the first report, the IPCC didn't claim that the warming of the planet was due to the greenhouse gases. So they said it can be the greenhouse gases, but it can also be just a natural phenomenon. So this is very interesting, because nowadays the IPCC, of course, it's all about greenhouse gases. But in the first report, they were very modest about this. And then, what happened in 1992, some of you will know this, it was the Rio conference. And this is the official start of the international climate policy. Yeah? Here, the Paris Agreement in 2015 is just like a follow-up conference on this conference. And in this conference, they said the ultimate objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic means human, caused by humans, interference with the climate system. So in the Rio Agreement, they already say, the politicians already say, we have to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. But remember, the first report didn't even claim that the warming was due to greenhouse gases. And in my opinion, this is already where things went wrong. Because what happens here is that the politicians are moving ahead of the scientists. You know, they already say we have to stop greenhouse gas emissions, while the scientists haven't yet concluded that the warming is due to the greenhouse gases. And this is very problematic in my opinion. And so they start working on the Kyoto Protocol. You probably heard of the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah? That was the first international agreement about climate. It started in 1997. So then, between 1992 and 1997, we have the second IPCC report. So, it is very interesting to see what is the second report saying about the warming. Well, this report, we have to say, the report is published in several steps. You have the first draft, you have the second draft, and then you have the final report. And so each draft is reviewed by a lot of scientists. So what was written in the final draft? No study to date has both detected a significant climate change and attributed. Attributed means that you can point to the cause. That you can say this is the cause. Yeah, you attribute it to the cause. Yeah? So you attribute it to greenhouse gases. All or part of that change to anthropogenic causes. This is the final draft. So, in the second report, the scientists of the IPCC still say there is warming, but we don't know. Is it natural or is it greenhouse gases? We don't know. And then what happens is very interesting. They come together for a final meeting, and this happened in 1995 in Madrid. So these government delegations, they meet in Madrid. And this is the final draft. But then, there comes an American scientist, Ben Center, and he tells the chairman of the IPCC at that time, it's John Houghton, and he tells him, John, I have new evidence that the warming is caused by humans. And this evidence is very important, and I think we have to change it. But this is a no-go. Normally, first you have to publish it in a peer-reviewed article, before the deadline of the IPCC report, and then it can be taken into account in the IPCC report. But this paper, the paper by Ben Center, was not even submitted yet. It was just brand new evidence. But the chairman said, okay, Ben, you can give a talk and explain what you have done. And so this happened in Madrid with the government delegations, and then there was a big fight. And you had a very famous skeptic, Fred Singer. He's from the United States. He passed away a few years ago. He was 90 somewhat. And this was funny. At the time, Fred Singer was part of the delegation of Saudi Arabia. In this period, in this time, in the 90s, there was still some money from oil companies going to skeptical voices about this topic. So Fred Singer was in the delegation of Saudi Arabia. And he objected. He said, what is going on here is against the rules of the IPCC. And he was right about that. But so there was a big fight, and on Friday night, when most government delegations had to fly back home, but there was no agreement about it. And then when most countries were already gone, they decided to change the text. They decided to change the text. And what did it become? The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the global climate. So suddenly, this text, which was in the report, was changed into this. So suddenly, they say, we found the evidence. It is humans. Humans caused the climate change. And this became a big fight in the United States in the year after, because Frederick Seitz was a very prominent scientist in the US. He was the president of the National Academy of Science. He heard from Fred Singer what had happened in Madrid. And this happened only in '96, only 3/4 of a year later. The report was finally released, and then they could, Fred Singer and Frederick Seitz, they could check what was the final text in the report. And they noticed that not only this was written in the summary for policymakers, but Ben Center also changed the underlying chapters, which is really a no-go. You cannot, after you already finalized the report, you cannot suddenly change the underlying chapters, you know. This is no-go. So, Frederick Seitz, he wrote an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal, a major deception on global warming. And I think he was right on this, yeah. But then all hell broke loose in the United States. And in my opinion, this is where the climate debate went wrong, because most climate scientists in the US had to choose sides. Do we choose the side of Ben Center, or do we choose the side of Fred Singer, who was paid by the oil industry and who was a skeptic? And then most mainstream climate scientists, they choose the side of Ben Center, who in this case was, in my opinion, who was terribly wrong. And then the polarization about climate started in the US and then globally. And what happened then was that the oil companies quickly dropped the funding for the skeptics, because they were like also attacked for funding money to skeptics. And so since the 1990s, there is no money anymore from the oil industry or any other industry to climate skeptics, until today. So today you still hear some people say, oh, Clintel, even in Holland, they say Clintel is paid by the oil industry. This is nonsense, you know. There is no money for the last 25 years. There is no money from the oil industry to climate critical voices anymore. And this happened all after the second report. So here is the screenshot of this major deception. And there was even written a book by Bernie Lewin about this affair. It's 400 pages. I don't recommend reading it, but it's 400 pages. It was published by the Global Warming Policy Foundation in London. So this was really, in my opinion, this is where it went wrong. So the IPCC became political, because they had to, in 1995, they had to come up with the evidence that it is greenhouse gases, because otherwise the Rio conference, the climate agreement, was dead in the water, you know. Why do you need the Kyoto Protocol if the scientists don't even know if the warming is natural or caused by greenhouse gases? So this was really like the politics taking over the IPCC. So then we move on to the third IPCC report, and that was all about this graph. It's called the hockey stick graph. Who has seen this graph before? Yeah? No, not many people. Okay. So then it's good to explain a little bit. Here you see the temperature in the year 1000 to the year 2000, and you see, and this part, the blue and the black part, is mostly based on tree rings. So a tree ring you can date very precisely. So if you find a tree, you can say this tree was living in the 9th century from 800 till 1100 or whatever. And so each ring you can date very precisely. And they try to get a temperature signal out of the tree. That's very difficult, of course, to do, but they do it. And what they do here is they then do statistics, and they say this is like the global temperature, or well, at least the northern hemisphere temperature. And this graph, of course, is very impressive, because it suggests that the climate is more or less stable until 1900. And what is happening in 1900? We humans are starting to use fossil fuels. Coal, and later oil and gas. And so we are starting to emit CO2. And then the climate is warming up very quickly. Red, by the way, is temperature measurement. So you cannot compare red with the blue and the black, because that's apples with pears, you know. The black one is based on tree rings and ice cores, and the red is measured temperature with temperature stations. Yeah. But nevertheless, this graph became very influential in the third report. It was published in different forms 6 or 7 times in the IPCC report. And it was the opening graph of the summary for policymakers. So they made it iconic. Well, then, a few years later, the graph, by the way, was published by Michael Mann, an American climate scientist, in 1998 in Nature. So, a top science journal, Nature, published this graph. Then, in 2003, there were 2 Canadians, McIntyre and McKittrick. I think I have McIntyre and McKittrick, 2 Canadians. They didn't know each other, and McIntyre, who was working in a different field, he got a brochure in his house, so that the Canadian government gave brochures to every citizen in Canada with the hockey stick graph. And McIntyre, who is a statistician and who was a bit bored with his work, he said, "Well, what's this graph about? What's the data behind it?" He was always interested in the data behind the graph. You know, how is the graph? What is the data? What is the statistic used? And so he sent a message to Michael Mann, and he said, "Can you send me the data and your mathematical, your statistical procedure?" And then Michael Mann replied, "Oh, I don't know where the data are." And McIntyre immediately was very curious, because he thought, okay, this is so influential, this graph, it should, and it's in the IPCC report, so it should have been checked by lots of people, you know. But he found out that nobody ever checked this graph. So he started to check it. And he worked on this for 2 years. It took him 2 years to find out how the graph was made, actually. And I was a science journalist, and when I was working at a magazine, a monthly magazine in 2004, and my editor-in-chief said, "Marcel, there is something going on with a graph called the hockey stick graph. Can you look into this?" So I had to write an article about it. I never wrote about climate. I had to look into this. And then, of course, after doing some research, I found information about these two guys. But what happened was that their criticism, they criticized the graph, but they tried to publish it in Nature. But Nature rejected their paper. So I was starting to do interviews in the Netherlands with all kinds of university scientists and KMI, and I asked, what about McIntyre and McKittrick? And they said to me, oh, don't take them serious because they are no climate scientists, and their paper was rejected. But in the end, I went to Hamburg in Germany, and there was a German professor. He was also slightly critical about the hockey stick, and I asked him, what about McIntyre and McKittrick? And he said, their Nature paper should have been published. And when he said that, I said, okay, then I have to take him serious. And so I contacted McIntyre, and I spoke with him on the phone for 3 hours. And then his whole story, because he was working on this for 2 years. I was more or less the first journalist in the world who wanted to listen to what this guy was doing, you know. And then in the end, they gave me the scoop of their work. And so, with my first article on climate, I was immediately, not only in the Dutch climate debate, but I was in the center of like the global climate debate. We published it in Holland, and we also published it in Canada. And it later also played a role in what's called ClimateGate, because he hacked emails in 2009, and they deal all with this hockey stick affair. My article is even in the ClimateGate emails. So I was in the middle of the debate. What's funny is that McIntyre is using this picture on his Twitter profile, his X profile, but if I remember well, I made this picture myself. In 2008 when I visited them in Toronto. Anyway, so this was my article. I'm not very happy with this proof that mankind causes climate change is refuted. So this is what happens when you work in a company, you know, this is like a media company, and so I had to explain them, this is my article about, you know, we criticized IPCC, but they also made it political. You know, they made it political to draw attention, but I don't like this. In hindsight, I don't like this very much. You know, just try to be focused on what is the criticism. IPCC should have checked this graph, and they didn't do it. And 2 outsiders had to work for 2 years without payment to check it, and when they did, they found out that the graph was rubbish. Yeah, you can literally throw it away. It's meaningless. The result is meaningless. And this is very serious. Okay, so we go on to the 4th IPCC report. It was published in 2007. And starting from that, by the way, they didn't publish a hockey stick in 2007. So they were a little bit like aware of the criticism. They didn't acknowledge the criticism of McIntyre. Not really, they didn't acknowledge it, but they didn't publish another hockey stick. Anyway, from then on, this is the iconic statement. Most of the warming since the mid-20th century is very likely due to observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse. This is the terminology that is used a lot in IPCC reports. It makes it quite unreadable for you as an outsider, probably. You know, it's like most of the warming, very likely. So very likely is for them is 90% sure. 90% sure. But it's not a statistical probability. It's based on expert judgment. So if you are like a group of IPCC people and you vote about this statement, you say how likely is this statement, and you say, is it 90% likely? Yes, I agree. Yeah, and then if you all agree with 90%, okay, we make it very likely. You know, so this has nothing to do with what people will normally believe about probability. It's not a statistical probability. It's just like hand waving. You know, it's like voting. It's expert judgment. Anyway, then we had 2009, the hacked emails, and this did anyone hear about ClimateGate? No? No. So ClimateGate happened in 2009, just before the climate conference in Copenhagen. And what it was like thousands of emails from influential IPCC scientists. And so we can read how they communicate among themselves. You know, and it's not very good what you see. What you see is that they are very busy, not by saving the planet, but by how can we exclude climate skeptics from the IPCC report? Even how can we exclude them from the scientific literature? So if, for example, a journal publishes an article by a climate skeptic, they will discuss how can we fire the editor there, you know, because we don't like that they published this paper. And these are the games that they are playing. And one of the most horrendous things in the ClimateGate emails is what is called hide the decline. And this has to do with the hockey stick reconstructions. And this is the quote: "I have just completed Mike is Michael Mann from the hockey stick, Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years. And from 1961 for Keith to hide the decline." So what is this about? Keith Briffa, he's a British climate scientist. He passed away a few years ago. And Phil Jones is also one of these they call themselves the hockey team. Yeah, this is their name. They give it. It's not me joking with them. No, they say we are the hockey team. So he is also part of the hockey team, as this guy and Mike and Keith. So they are discussing what's going on here. Keith Briffa also has a reconstruction based on tree rings, but his reconstruction in the 1960 is going down. What the heck is going on? You know, his tree ring. This is based on tree rings. The tree rings he's using are saying that the temperatures are going down. But we know from temperature measurements with temperature stations that the temperature is going up. So what a normal scientist would say is maybe tree rings are not very good temperature indicators after all, you know. But what they did is, what you can see here, they have different reconstructions, and the green one suddenly stops. So it should, from here, it should go down, but they didn't want to show it. They didn't want to show the decline. So this is what they mean with hide the decline. You know? And so this is very unscientific behavior, of course. And this was all exposed by the ClimateGate emails. But did you hear about the IPCC being abolished or scientists being fired? No, it didn't happen. So this is really very bad behavior. But anyway, what happened after this ClimateGate, at least suddenly some journalists started to write about errors that they found in the IPCC report. And the most famous one is what's called Himalaya Gate. You will never have heard about it, but in the IPCC report was a sentence that all the glaciers in the Himalaya would be melted in 2035. So that's in about 12 years from now, all the Himalaya glaciers are gone. Well, that's of course, if you think about it for a second or 3 seconds, that's ridiculous, you know. The Himalaya, I've never been there, but it's like 8,000 meters and higher, you know. How could the glaciers be gone in 20 years? And this claim was based not on a peer-reviewed paper, but on an article in New Scientist. It's a popular science magazine. So it was ridiculous, and so it was an error. And then the IPCC was put under pressure by media, by the politicians, and the Inter-Academy Council. That's a joint. In every country you have like a National Academy of Science. You know, probably here as well. And we also have one, and you have the National Academy of Science in America. And they together, they have the Inter-Academy Council. And so they had to do a review of the IPCC. That's the only time that happened. Because of ClimateGate and because of these errors. And the report is, I have to say, the report is not bad. They don't look into the errors, but they look in the procedures. So they look if the IPCC is organized properly, and if they're functioning well. Yeah, they don't look at the science itself. And one recommendation that I think is most important is this one. The author team for each chapter is intended to have a range of views, expertise and geographical representation. But a range of views. this is most important. You can easily fix IPCC by adding 1 or 2 climate skeptics to each chapter. Yeah. In the US you say to keep them honest, to keep the others honest. But what is the IPCC doing in practice? They invite only scientists that already agree with their main message. And scientists with other views are simply not invited. Yeah? People like me, I have been an expert reviewer. They cannot reject you as a reviewer. So I have been an expert reviewer of IPCC reports. But as a reviewer, you have no power at all. If you are a reviewer of a peer-reviewed publication, you can say, I reject the paper because it's so bad, because A, B, C, D, I reject. And if the other reviewers also reject it, the journal has to reject it. But you cannot do that with an IPCC report. So you can give your critique on the IPCC, but there is a big chance that they don't change anything. Yeah? So this is the big problem that the IPCC has. So then at the time I was like working for 5 years on the climate issue. I was like completely, I was now obsessed, maybe it's not a good word, but I thought it's so important. So I published this book in Dutch, The State of the Climate. And so this already was like my 5 years of experience in the climate debate with the hockey stick and with IPCC reports, etc. And since then I'm like the national climate denier of the Netherlands, you know, this is how they frame you. But also in the Netherlands, I have to say there was some support for my work. Then we go on to the 5th IPCC report. And in that report, climate sensitivity was a very important topic. What is climate sensitivity? Well, climate sensitivity is simply that if CO2 goes up, and we know CO2 goes up, you know, CO2 goes up, and probably because of us. CO2 goes up, you want to know, is the effect of CO2, does it have a big effect on climate, on the warming of the climate, or does it have a small effect? And that's what they mean with climate sensitivity. If you have a sensitive climate, it means more CO2 will give a lot of warming. And if you have an insensitive climate, it will give little warming. As you can see, all kinds of reports. It starts in 1979 with the Charney report in the US, and then you have all the IPCC reports. They believe that climate sensitivity, this is climate sensitivity, that it's somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5. What do they mean? They mean that if you double the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, so that's the definition of climate sensitivity. You double the CO2 concentration, yeah? How much warming will it give of the planet? Yeah? And they say that it will give, what did I do? They say that in general they believe it will give 3 degrees of warming, yeah? That's the best estimate. Yeah? And they go lower and then they give 3 again. But in the 5th IPCC, and the range is 1.5 to 4.5. So they admit that climate sensitivity is very uncertain. They say we think it's 3 degrees, but it could also be 1.5, 4.5, or anything in between, or even outside this range. Because this range is like the likely, range. Well, anyway, so it's not even the full range. Yeah? So it's very uncertain. And this is very interesting. In the 5th report, they suddenly don't give a best estimate anymore. So at the same time, in this report, they are very certain. They then say, all of the warming is due to the CO2. So they are very certain about CO2 causing the warming, but they don't want to give a best estimate anymore. And me and a British colleague, Nick Lewis and I wrote a report about this. It's called A Sensitive Matter. We analyze how the IPCC buried evidence showing good news about global warming. What was going on? This is complicated, but now you have to look carefully. Here you see the climate sensitivity. So this is the 3 degrees. They think it's 3 degrees. But what Nick Lewis was doing, based on the data, is that we have now temperature data starting in 1850, and this period is now long enough to use the observational data. So we have temperature data, we have data about greenhouse gases, we have some data about what's going on in the oceans, how much heat, how much energy is going on in the oceans. And what Nick Lewis is doing is that you use the observations to estimate climate sensitivity, and using these different periods, so a period at the beginning and a period at the end, you get these estimates for climate sensitivity, and you see that, so the peak here is about 1.6. So Lewis is saying, even if I follow the IPCC and I go along with them, I go along with all their data, and I use the observations to estimate climate sensitivity, then climate sensitivity seems to be at the low end, because 1.6, you see the range was always 1.5, 4.5, and he says the best estimate is 1.6. They didn't want to give a best estimate. And the reason is that IPCC reports, and Guus Berghardt already mentioned it, IPCC reports rely a lot on climate models. And the climate models are much more sensitive. The climate models are here. On average, the climate models have a climate sensitivity of 3.4. But Lewis showed that the observations indicate a much lower climate sensitivity of about 1.6. And so what happened during this, when they prepared the report, is that they started to realize that the observations and the models are way out of touch with each other. And we skeptics like to say that the models are oversensitive to the greenhouse gases. So the models, if you increase CO2 in the models, they will warm up much more quick than the real climate is doing. And I will show some evidence later of that. So, then finally, we come to the sixth report. And this is the working group 1 and this is the working group 2 report. And we, in our book, the Frozen Climate Views of the IPCC, we only analyze these 2 reports. And you have to realize both are more than 1,000 pages long. We didn't go through everything, of course, that's impossible, but we selected some important topics to review. So, and then you have to realize that the IPCC itself, this is from their website, they claim that the reports are comprehensive and balanced. And comprehensive means you take into account all the evidence. That means comprehensive. All the evidence. You cannot cherry pick just the evidence that you like. No, you have to take into account all the scientific literature that is relevant for your assessment. So, we did it with a team of 8 people from around the world. Here you see Ross McKittrick again. He wrote the chapter. He was the guy who criticized the hockey stick. He wrote a lot of excellent papers on climate. He's an economist, an econometrician, I have to say. He's a very good statistician. Nicolas Carfetta knows a lot about the solar influence. He's from Italy, and Imei was my co-author from the United States. Javier Viños, you know him because I just heard he was here last year. Yeah, he wrote some books. Frits Weinhold is from Germany, he's from the US. Ole Humlem is from Norway, and I'm of course from the Netherlands. So we did this with an international team. Some of them wrote the chapter together, and some of them on their own. And well, just you remember the height and decline. In which they called about a trick. Yeah, they completed Mike's Nature trick. So this is the word that they like to use in their internal communication. And what I will do to give some examples of the things that IPCC is doing also again in this 6th report, I will also use the word trick. It's not meant to be like to talk very badly about them, but just to make it a little bit humorous. Well, the trick number 1 is rewrite history. You probably know this book, George Orwell, 1984. Who read it? Most of you? No. It's very famous, of course. He wrote it in 1948, and it's like a dystopian future. It's dealing about the Ministry of Truth. And in the Ministry of Truth, it's fiction of course, but in this Ministry of Truth, the people working there, they have to rewrite the history all the time, every day. So if something is not in favor of their political leader, which is called Big Brother, then they go back in the archives and they will literally change the history. And so, and a famous quote that you probably have heard: who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And what I will show is that this is exactly what IPCC is doing. IPCC controls the present for sure. They have all the power, they have all the authority. I don't have it. And what they try to do is control the past. And I will show how they do it. In the 6th report, they published this graph. And this looks familiar probably now, you know. This is a new hockey stick graph. And McIntyre and McKittrick and myself, we were really surprised, because for several reports they really didn't dare to publish the hockey stick graph. But now, probably they think, okay, McIntyre is gone and nobody knows. So they published a new hockey stick graph. But I now want to focus on this part. This part is claiming that it's the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years. So with this part, they want to show that the current warming, which is slightly higher than this bar, that the current warming is even higher, if there is more warming than in the last 100,000 years. Now, most of you will know that the last ice age ended 12,000 years ago. Since then we have a warming period which is called the Holocene. And what they are claiming is that it's now warmer than during the Holocene. Before that was an ice age, so it's logical that it's now warmer than during the ice age. But they also claim that it's warmer than during the Holocene. And they say in the text, global surface temperature are more likely than not unprecedented. This is a very famous word that they always like to use. Unprecedented in the past 125,000 years. This is a claim in the IPCC report. Well, the underlying paper is Kaufman et al. And this chapter was actually written by Javier Viños, the Spanish. And he looked at the paper and the error bar in the paper, and the error bar in the paper already seems to disagree with the claim. Because you see, this one is higher, if you go, is higher than this. So even the paper itself doesn't support the claim. Yeah, this is one funny thing that Javier found. But I would say there is more important evidence. I want to show a picture that I like showing. If you go to the mountains and you go to the Alps, I like going to the mountains and hiking and that kind of stuff. This is in Switzerland, the Susten Pass in Switzerland, and you notice all kind of pictures that in 1856 the glacier was still here. In 1922 it's withdrawing, yeah? And now the glacier is here, or even shorter now, you know. So the glacier is withdrawing, and people claim, of course, that this is because of climate change and this is because of greenhouse gases. But some Swiss scientists, they did some field work here. They did a lot of field work here, and they tried to reconstruct this area. How it looked like, probably looked like 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago. I did some classical high school, and I learned that Hannibal went over the Alps with his elephants, and he went all the way to Rome, you know. And this was 2,000 years ago. And 2,000 years ago, it probably looked like this. So what you see is there are trees everywhere, and nowadays there are no trees. So the tree line is much higher, and there is no glacier. There is no glacier. So the glacier came into being only more recent than 2,000 years ago. You know, and now it's withdrawing again. But it's not like 2,000 years. It must have been warmer, at least in this place. It must have been warmer 2,000 years ago than it is now. So this goes against the hockey stick. The hockey stick claims it's now warmer than then, but this goes against it. It's clear observational evidence. And we have more. This is a glacier in Greenland. And here is the Ice Age. And then we go out of the Ice Age. Then you get what is called the Younger Dryas. Suddenly it gets cooler again. We don't know exactly why this happened. And then we go out of the Ice Age. But this process ends already, like the warming peaks around 10,000 years ago. 10,000, 9,000, 8,000 years ago. And in the literature, this period is called the Holocene climate optimum, or thermal maximum. So climate optimum suggests that scientists before, they saw it as something good. Yeah, an optimum, a warm period is an optimum, you know. And if you look into the IPCC report for the term Holocene climate optimum, you don't find it anywhere. So they erase it from history, you know. They don't want to mention the Holocene climate optimum. They don't want to, of course they don't show a graph like this. And what you see is that starting from here, the glacier the area is already going into a phase that we call neoglaciation. It's already on their way to the new glacial period, you know. And this is the last 150 years. So this is the warming in the where all the fuss is about, you know. But this is the broader picture. And here you have tree lines. The tree line. So that is the tree line means the altitude where the trees stop growing, you know. Above that you have no trees anymore. The tree line. Yeah. And you see that in the Swiss Alps, 8,000 years ago, so we already saw from 2,000 years ago, it was higher, but 8,000 years ago it was even higher. And there were probably very little glaciers in the Alps, you know. So this is clearly observational evidence, and you find this kind of graphs you can also find in North America, for example, you know. So this is very likely, in my opinion, if I use the IPCC terminology, this is very likely a global signal that we see, that there is an Holocene optimum that is much higher. The Arctic, for example, the Arctic was ice-free for now. Al Gore is shouting, oh, if we go on like this, the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer. But the Arctic was, for thousands of years, the Arctic was ice-free in the summer. Yeah? But this gets very little media attention. So Javier said it's more likely than not that the past decade is warmer than any century during the past 12,000 years. Is an untenable claim. That's his conclusion in the report. This is also a very famous quote. It quotes from the Ministry of Truth. This is actually in the book. This is on the outside of the building. It's written in the Ministry of Truth: "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." George Orwell, 1984. And I want to add the IPCC version of this. IPCC style, warm is cold. You know, if it was warm in the past, you simply say it's cold. You know, so you rewrite history. Okay, so we go on to the next trick. This is a very short and simple one. Use shorter and shorter periods to claim acceleration of trends. Okay, this is very easy to understand. It's based on acceleration in sea level rise. Of course, sea level rise is very important. I'm from Holland, where I live close to the sea. It's below sea level. I think I only live 1 meter below sea level, but very close to the sea, only 5 kilometers. So my house will be drowned, you know. So sea level is very important to me and to all the Dutch people. This is from the IPCC report. They say global mean sea level increased by 0.2 meters. So this is only 20 centimeters between 1901 and 2018. Look carefully at only, they say, only 20 centimeters in more than a century. This is all that's happened in the last century. But then they go on. The average rate of sea level rise was 1.3 millimeters per year between 1901 and 1971, then increasing to 1.9. So it's accelerating, and then further increasing to 3.7 millimeter a year between 2006 and 2018. 2006 to 2018 is only 12 years. Yeah? Sea level is also influenced by the tide, by the moon, by the forces between the Earth and the moon. You know, and there are periods involved, and one of the periods is 18 years. So 12 years is less than one period. You cannot talk about sea level rise in a period of 12 years. And they say this is high confidence, that is 3.7. So they claim there is a huge acceleration going on. What is the graph? This is the graph from the IPCC report. And here in this period we have also satellite measurements. Here they claim that there is this acceleration. Okay, it looks a bit like an acceleration. But what they didn't show is that, and you have to be careful, now the trend in sea level is now here on the vertical axis. So if 0 is no sea level rise, and if you go up here it's 3 millimeters a year, so this is more rapid, and this is slower sea level rise. And what you see, the blue one is measurements. The blue one is measurements. What you see is that sea level rise is like oscillating in time. There is an oscillation, and it was peaking here, and it is peaking here. And what they are doing is they use this peak to say that there is like an acceleration. But it's too early. It's too early to call. Normally, we normally would expect that starting from now on, sea level rise will go down. The rate will go down again in the coming 30 years. So only in 20, 30 years we can say, if they are right, that sea level is really increasing, accelerating or not. And to compare, CO2 is increasing, yes. This is the atmospheric CO2, and you see that after World War II, the CO2 emissions are really like increasing very rapidly, you know. And this is also a red flag for me, because if you look at the whole period, the sea level rise is actually very steady. It's very steady. I will show some pictures, more graphs later. So the sea level already starts rising in this period here, between 1840 and 1900. The sea level starts rising here, but at that time, CO2 is not doing much. You know, and after 1950, CO2 is increasing rapidly, but the sea level is very moderate. And yeah, so this is, for me, this is very important indication that probably CO2 is not like the thermostat. It's not the thermostat, it's not like the driving force of the climate. Anyway, IPCC already also launched, together with NASA, they launched a sea level tool, and this is very interesting. Well, Hungary is not at the sea, of course. But if you live at the sea, you can use this tool to check your own location. And Ole Humlen, our Norwegian author, he checked for a few places in Scandinavia. Here you see Oslo, and these are the measurements for Oslo. What the heck is going on? Oslo, the sea level is going down. How is this possible? We have global warming, sea level should go up. Is there anybody who knows why this is going on? Scandinavia is still bouncing back from the last ice age. So during the last ice age, there was a few kilometers of ice on Scandinavia, and this was so heavy that the whole the earth below Scandinavia was really like pushed down. And when the ice age ended, the ice melted, and then Scandinavia started to come back up. And this process is still going on. So yes, sea level is rising, but Scandinavia is rising more rapidly than the sea level. So the relative sea level in Oslo is going down. Yeah? But then the IPCC tool is predicting what, starting in 2020, the sea level is going to do with their climate models. And that's the blue curve. So IPCC is claiming that from now on, the curve should go up. And this is completely, in my opinion, this is completely crazy. It's much more likely that the trend will continue like this. Yeah? But of course we will see in 10-20 years. Copenhagen, he also looked at Copenhagen, so Copenhagen is almost flat, and there you see the same, a big jump in 2020, and you see it everywhere. So again, you see that the models that IPCC is using are probably oversensitive. They react too much on the CO2, and so they are warming up too much, but they also then, the sea level is going up too fast. Yeah? So their models are really unreliable in this respect. Okay, we go on. Trick number 3 is hiding good news. They are very good in that. I showed already in the 5th report with the climate sensitivity, which they didn't very outspoken, were not very outspoken about. We know Antonio Guterres, this year he was talking about global boiling. We entered the era of global boiling, you know. And this was what he said a year ago, we are on a highway to climate hell. And often when they talk about this, they mean extremes. They say that the climate is getting more extreme. And by that they mean you get more hurricanes, more floods, more droughts, more forest fires, heat waves, all those things. So it's very important to check the literature and to check what the IPCC report is saying about this. And this is coming from an American scientist, Roger Pielke Jr. I will mention him several times, he's very important. And when the IPCC report came out, he immediately drew this table. So this table is from him. And here you see all kinds of extremes. And here you see detection and attribution. So detection means that a trend is detected. A change, a statistical change is detected. And attribution means that we can attribute it to greenhouse gases. And these are just the claims from the IPCC report itself. They say heat waves, yes, there is an increase in heat waves. Yes, it is because of the greenhouse gases. That is what they claim. Heavy precipitation, yes, and here are some other things. But then, look at the things in white. Flooding, meteorological drought, hydrological drought, tropical cyclones. Tropical cyclones in the Atlantic, they are called hurricanes. So hurricanes is the same as tropical cyclones. Winter storms, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hail, lightning, extreme winds. They say, no, we don't have a detected change. And if there is no change, you don't have to find the cause. Yeah? If there is no person murdered, you don't have to look for the murderer. You know, this is how they think. And this is really good news because I will tell you, flooding and tropical cyclones, they are responsible for 90% of the global damage. Floods and hurricanes are the most damaging extreme weather events. Heat waves can be annoying, you know, if there is a heat wave here in Budapest in the summer and it's 40 degrees, you have to take care of yourself, of the older people, you have to air conditioning maybe, drink enough, stay inside, etc. But you can manage heat waves. There's not much damage to buildings, etc. But flooding and hurricanes, they cause most of the damage. And IPCC admits, no, there is no, we cannot claim that CO2 has anything to do so far, has any effect on hurricanes and flooding. This is very important news. So you hope that IPCC will shout this from the roof, you know, but of course they don't. And to show, to give some evidence for this is landfalling hurricanes. So this is simply the hurricanes. So recently we had in Florida, we had Helene and Milton, two very powerful hurricanes that caused a lot of damage and also casualties. Yeah. And so in 2024, Helene and Milton will say that those are two hurricanes that came on land. Yeah? So here it's simply the number of hurricanes that came on land. And the red line is the trend. So you see that there in general, and it starts in 1900, so in general there is no trend. We don't have more hurricanes. And globally, we have data since 1980. This is based on satellite data. The top graph is all hurricanes, and the below graph is the major hurricanes. You see it's going up and down, but there is no real trend. So this is really very good news. These graphs were also published in peer-reviewed papers for the first time in 2018. So the IPCC should know about these publications. Publication is not mentioned. It's not mentioned in the IPCC. These are the things that we do. We know these papers, we just check in the report. Did they mention Klotzbach et al. 2018? No, they ignore it. And they don't show the graph, of course. Yeah? This was also published in a peer-reviewed paper, and this is updated. You know, I updated this yesterday for my presentation. It's updated very frequently, September 20. This guy, Ryan Mao, is a very interesting guy. He updates this graph very frequently. What do they say about flooding? In summary, there is low confidence in the human influence on the changes in high river flows. We can forget about the rest. This is IPCC speak for saying low confidence in human influence on the changes in high river flows. We don't see anything in the rivers. We don't see anything with river flooding. We don't see any trend. Globally, yeah? This is globally. So this is very, very important information. Then you go to the summary for policymakers that I describe in the book. And what do they actually, in this case, they actually give opposite claims in the summary for policymakers. So in the summary for policymakers, they suddenly claim that there is some change in hurricanes and there is something going on with flooding. So they are really like messing up there. So we go to trick number 4. Yeah, that's the good old cherry picking. We all do cherry picking, by the way. I also do cherry picking in a sense because nobody can be complete, you know. But of course, if you make a report like 1,000 pages and you are IPCC, you have to be comprehensive. And what we found here was really shocking. This is the most shocking error that I have seen in my 20 years of dealing with this topic. So, what's it about? There was a hurricane in Miami in 1926. Here you see a picture, and of course there is a lot of damage. But you also notice that there are not many buildings. I don't have a picture of Miami nowadays, but if you've been in Miami, this is completely built now. Yeah? Completely built. So you realize that if the same hurricane now hits Miami, you have much more damage. Because you have more buildings, and the buildings that are there are more expensive, of course, because of inflation and things like that. So if you want to compare the hurricane of this year with the hurricane in 1926, you somehow have to normalize the data. Yeah? And this is what scientists are doing in the field. So they talk about normalized US hurricane damage. Now we have 2 papers. This is a paper about normalized hurricane damage in the United States between 1900 and 2005. Roger Bucke Jr., there he is again. He's a specialist in this field. He actually was the first who came up with this method for normalization of the data. And his study is cited by 1,216 other scientists. That's a lot. You've been a scientist. If you have a paper that's cited so many times, you're proud. You have a good paper, you know. And there is another paper also looking at normalized US hurricane damage, the same period, and this shows a trend upward. But it cannot both be true. And in the chapter of our book, we show that in total there are 7 studies looking at normalized hurricane damage in the US, and 6 of them are similar like this. They show no overall trend in hurricane damage, and only this one came up with an upward trend. And in the chapter we explain that this paper is even flawed. So the result is flawed. And it was cited, it was a very recent paper, it was published in 2019. So in 2019, they're already working for many years on the IPCC report. They're already close to the deadline, you could say. Yeah? So this paper is very fresh. Nevertheless, what they do is they highlight this paper and they ignore this one. They don't even mention it. And it gets worse. It gets much, much worse. Because Roger Bucke Jr. is I told you, he's very familiar with the literature. He published a paper, and from this paper is his table 1. Studies focused on specific phenomena and studies focused on particular region. This is all about normalized damage. And sometimes the damage is from the United States, sometimes China, sometimes here it's tropical cyclones, and here it's like extratropical storms, and sometimes it's flooding. So you have different kinds of extreme weather in different parts of the world. All peer-reviewed publications, and they normalize the data, and after they normalize the data, you can look at, is there like an attribution? So can you say that this has something to do with greenhouse gases? And these are 53 studies, and of the 53 studies, all say no, except one, and that's this one. And that one is the Grinstead et al. 2019 paper that we just mentioned. Here, that's this paper. That's the only one of all the 53 studies that have been published, and that should have been taken into account by IPCC. IPCC should be comprehensive. So they should have mentioned all these papers, more or less. Yeah? And they ignored all the papers, and they only mentioned this one. To claim an increase in damage because of climate change, because of CO2 and greenhouse gases. And this is really the worst cherry picking I have ever seen in an IPCC report. This is, even for me, I have seen a lot of not so good things in IPCC reports, but this is really, really terrible. And the funny thing is that you have this guy, Bauer is Laurens Bauer, and Laurens Bauer is from Holland, and he was a co-author of the chapter. So Bauer was involved in this chapter in IPCC report. And his own paper says no. So in the IPCC reports, he draws conclusions that goes against his own peer-reviewed work. This to me is really like completely crazy. But the problem is that when our book came out, you want other journalists. I don't want to go after this guy, you know. So I suspect that he is involved in this. He should know better. He should know better. But I should not go after him because I already did the analysis. Other journalists should go ask him, Laurens, how is this possible? How did you let it go? How did you accept this in the report? Well, if we look at the global disaster losses, this is also a paper by Roger Bucke Jr., peer-reviewed paper, ignored by the IPCC again. And so if you look at the global disaster losses, the trend is actually down. So if you normalize the data, and so you correct for population growth and for economic growth, the trend is actually down. And this is not surprising because the population is getting more wealthy, and if we get more wealthy, we have better technology. Look at Holland. This lady here in front just told me that she was in Holland because we are so good with water. Yeah, we have these dikes, we have these delta works. Yeah, we can protect ourselves against high tides and against flooding with dikes, etc. So by doing this, we invest a little money in adaptation, but by doing that, we prevent a lot of disaster losses. Yeah, and that's very important. And this works. This works globally even. Yeah. And so, yeah, but this was ignored, and this is a paper by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the hounding of Roger Bucke. What seems to be going on is that they treat him like Voldemort. Voldemort, you know Voldemort from Harry Potter books? Voldemort is like the devil, he who shall not be named. And it's literally like this. They ignore all his work, and his work is really good. And he is not even a climate skeptic. So he wrote a book about climate policy, The Climate Fix. So he acknowledges that CO2 is causing warming, that it is a problem, that we should do something about it. But he also says we should have integrity. As a scientist, we should have integrity. If there is no trend in disaster losses, we should be transparent. We should say it clearly. You know. Pukey told me he told me this personally. I frequently communicate with him. He said, I was nominated to participate in the SREX report. That's a special IPCC report about extreme weather. And he is a specialist in this. As one of the most published and cited authors on disasters and climate change, I was not selected. And a US government colleague told me that an IPCC official had told him that Roger Pukey will never participate in the IPCC. And I was allowed to show this quote. Yeah? Not only did he say that, but it has been true. He has never been invited to participate in the IPCC, although he publishes maybe more than any other scientist on hurricanes, on disaster losses and stuff that is really relevant for the IPCC. And they more or less admit we will never invite him to join us. And this is exactly what I told you earlier in the talk. You need, the Inter-Academy Council said you need a range of views. When you invite scientists, you need a range of views. But they don't do it. People like Roger Pukey, they excommunicate him. More good news, climate-related death. You would expect we have more people. And even if extremes are flat, even if we have not more extremes, you would expect more people dying from extreme weather because we have much more people. In this period, the global population increased from 2 billion to 8 billion. Yeah? 2 billion to 8 billion. But the climate-related deaths, so people dying because of flooding and hurricanes and droughts, etc., dropped by 98%. In absolute numbers, not relative numbers. In relative numbers, it's 99%. Yeah? In absolute numbers, it completely dropped to this. Yeah? And why is this happening? Has it anything to do with climate? No, it has nothing to do with climate. It has everything to do with prosperity. Because we became more prosperous, we can handle extreme weather much better than a century ago. A century ago, if there was a drought, sometimes millions of people could die because of lack of food. The harvest would go, there would be no harvest, no crop yield, and then people would die because of hunger. But nowadays this doesn't happen anymore. So this is extremely good news. And it's based on a database, it's called the MDOT database in Belgium, in Brussels. And the database is mentioned by the IPCC, so they are aware of this database. But this was published by Björn Lomborg in a peer-reviewed paper. Did they show this graph? Of course not. Did they show the data? More or less. They used the same database to show this. But what did they do? They say the average mortality per hazard, so per risk or per danger, between 2010 and 2020. So they only give like what's going on now. So they say in Africa people die because of drought, and in Asia most people die because of heat, and in Europe people die because of heat as well. You know, but they don't give this spectacular trend down. They simply don't give it. They didn't mention it. They didn't mention the data. They didn't mention it. Well, in a sense, in one sentence, they did mention this more or less, but they didn't highlight it. It's in the chapter that I wrote. So yeah, again, this is good news, and the IPCC is hiding the good news. I realize I'm talking far too long, but can I go on for 5 minutes? Yeah. This is the last example that I want to show. It's trick number 5. Crazy scenarios. Guus Berghout already said that IPCC is relying on models, and I already tried to explain that the models are probably oversensitive, so the models are generating too much warming. But there is something else, and people confuse these things. You have models, but the models you can also simulate the past century, you know, you can try to simulate the past, but you use scenarios for the future. And if you have scenarios for the future, you can use the scenarios in the models and then do a prediction for the coming century. Yeah? And that's what the IPCC is doing. Again, who controls the past controls the future. You know? This is what IPCC is doing. Okay. First, the models are still oversensitive. This is from the chapter by Ross McKittrick in the book. And here, you have to be careful. Here is the warming trend. So 0.2 means every 10 years we have 0.2 degrees of warming globally. Yeah? Or in the tropics. This is globally in the mid-troposphere. Mid-troposphere means higher in the troposphere. And the lower troposphere means closer to the surface. In red, you see all the models, and this one on the right is the average of all the models. In blue, you see the observations. Observations by satellites and observations by weather balloons that are taken around the world. Here you see globally and in the tropics, and you see that the models, all the models, have too much warming compared to the observations. All the models, there is no exception. The IPCC tries to downplay this and they say, yeah, maybe this is noise and this has to do with natural internal variability of the climate system. But if that would be the case, then you would expect some models are below the observations, some models are above the observations. No, all of them are above the observations. All of them are generating too much warming. And this is from the latest report. And the graph, this of course is not shown. This is not shown in the report, but in the text they admit it. At least in the text they admit, and they mention the paper. This is a paper by Ross McKittrick. Yeah? Okay, so this is very important. The models are still oversensitive. And this is also a complicated picture, but I want to show you. Here you see the climate sensitivity. Remember, IPCC always said climate sensitivity is about 3 degrees. That would be here. And Nick Lewis showed on observations that it probably more is between 1 and 2. If you look at the models, the red models are very sensitive models. And the blue models are not so sensitive models. And these are the observations. This is the observations for the lower troposphere, and this is the observation for the mid-troposphere. And you see that if you draw these lines, then based on the observations, you expect that the climate sensitivity should be here, between 1 and 2. Is exactly what Nick Lewis already found a few years ago as well. Yeah? So even the models, you can use their models and the observations to draw conclusions, and you see that even the not so sensitive models are still too sensitive. Yeah? So this is really like the whole bunch of models are oversensitive. Well, we go on to the scenarios. This is from the IPCC report. Here you have the warming. No, this is the sea level. This is the sea level in the past century, and then the IPCC is using models, scenarios, and so they use scenarios, 5 scenarios, and they feed the scenarios into the models. Yeah? So they have 5 scenarios and they feed them into the models. The models are oversensitive. Yeah? And the models are then generating like, and so this high scenario, SSP 5 8.5, will give like close to, so 80 centimeters. Say with that scenario, we will get 80 centimeters of sea level rise in 2100. Remember, the last century we had only 20 centimeters. So 80 centimeters is 4 times more in the coming century than in the past century. That's already incredible, you know. Anyway, what happened in the last few years is that these scenarios, 8.5 and 7.0, from the energy sector, from your sector, there were some specialists and they were looking at the scenarios and said, these scenarios, how realistic are they? You know? And then they found out that these scenarios are completely crazy. That's why I say crazy scenarios. These two scenarios are completely crazy, and I will explain why. You can easily see it. Here, first you see the global fossil CO2 emissions, and they're going up. And here you see the COVID, the pandemic. But then after the pandemic, it goes up again. But it is somewhat stabilizing. You know, it's not going rapidly up anymore. It's somewhat stabilizing. And you see that China and India are still building coal power plants, but United States and Europe are closing coal power plants because of climate policy. You know, so it's stabilizing. It's stabilizing a bit, and I expect that this stabilization will continue in the coming years. But now look at how this relates to the scenario. So what would you would expect something like this, maybe slightly up, but going like this. You know. Now look at the scenarios. Here is the last few years in black, and then RCP 8.5, the highest scenario, is going up from 40 all the way up to 120, 130 in 2100. So this is huge. It claims it's not stabilizing, but it will go up spectacularly. And so, but what happened was that in the literature, people started to point out that this scenario is completely unrealistic and should not be used. Actually, they say in the literature you should not even use it for policy purposes. So you should not use it to inform policymakers about what could happen in the future. You know, and then this is interesting. In IPCC, they give a mixed message on scenarios. They say in general, no likelihood is attached to the scenarios. So this is interesting. What they mean here is normally, as a policymaker, you would ask, if I was a policymaker, I would ask the climate expert, which scenario is the most likely one? Which is the most plausible one? You know, that's what you want to know. And IPCC is saying, we don't say anything about that. No likelihood. We don't say anything about the likelihood of the scenarios. So they could all be unrealistic or all be likely, anything. We don't say anything about it. But in the literature there was already evidence that the high scenario was unrealistic. And then in the report they say the likelihood of high emission scenarios such as RCP 8.5 is considered low in light of recent developments in the energy sector. So in the report they admit that RCP 8.5 is not very likely, but this is very likely. It's completely unrealistic. They don't say that clear, but at least they admit it in the report. But you would expect, in the summary for policymakers, shout this again, shout this from the roof, because it's very important that the policymakers realize this scenario is not realistic anymore. They don't do that. They don't mention it in the summary for policymakers. And it gets worse, because if you count how often do they mention RCP 8.5 in the report, the number of mentions is 1359. 41.5% of all the mentions is this high-end scenario. And that's not surprising, because in the literature, scientists love this scenario. Why do they love this scenario? Because it gives dramatic results. If you hear in the media, in 2100, if we don't do anything on the greenhouse gas emission, then so many people will die from flooding, or so many damage to the GDP, or anything about 2100 that is dramatic, is based on this scenario. And this scenario is still used today by scientists. Every day papers based on this scenario are still being published. And so that is on the one hand it's understandable, because IPCC just have to summarize the literature, And the literature is full of mentions of RCP 8.5. But on the other hand, it's problematic because it gives a wrong impression to the policymakers. Well, here is a paper. Here you see the 8.5, the yellow line. Here you see 7. And here you see like International Energy Agency. Those are very like, and the BP Energy Outlook and the ExxonMobil Outlook. These are very, very famous outlooks by energy experts. And they show that this is the trajectory that we are now on. And you see it falls outside the large range of these scenarios. So, and this is not based on like climate policy. No, this is just based on like what's going on right now. It's not based on future climate measures. And to give you another idea, in 2020 we have 151 exajoules, you can forget about that, in coal. We have nowadays 6,600 coal power plants around the world. In RCP 8.5, that will increase by this number, which means that we get 32,000 new coal power plants until 2100. That's only then. Only if you buy these plants, you can follow the RCP 8.5. It's completely crazy. But they use it, and they use it most often in the literature. That means one coal power plant every day until 2100. So every day we have to take into operation one new coal power plant somewhere in the world, every day from now on until 2100. And then you can follow RCP 8.5. And this is the scenario that has been most used by the IPCC in the report. So that's very problematic. Roger Buelke has written a lot, and he asked himself in one peer-reviewed paper, but that was published after the IPCC deadline, so they can ignore that one. The most realistic scenario nowadays is SSP 3.4. But 3.4, let's go back to the scenarios. Here you see the scenarios. R 8.5, 2.6, 4.5, 7.9, 1.9. I don't see any 3.4. No, exactly. 3.4 is not mentioned any time in the report. And according to Roger Buelke, based on the current data that we have, it's the most realistic one. It's not mentioned at all in the IPCC report. And if you feed that into the still oversensitive models, then you get about 2.2 degrees of warming in 2100. And remember, the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees of warming. And based on this scenario, we are now on the way to 2.2 degrees of warming in 2100. So that is already close to the Paris Agreement. And remember, this is still based on the oversensitive models. So in reality, my expectation, that would be even lower, because the models are oversensitive. So this is very good news, and of course it was not clearly communicated. So, what is the final conclusion? Preparing reports, you have to be comprehensive and balanced. Well, I gave lots of examples. They are not comprehensive and they are not balanced, you know. So, based on their own accounts, and we just assessed them, you know. We made an assessment of their assessment. And based on the examples that we checked, we can simply conclude they're not comprehensive and the report is also not balanced. And to summarize some of the findings, the IPCC is rewriting history because they want the current warming to be unprecedented. I've shown examples that probably 8,000 years ago it was much warmer than today. They are obsessed with the role of CO2 and ignore other factors like the sun. I didn't go into that. We have a chapter about how they treated the sun. And Javier probably told about that last year as well. The IPCC now says the influence of the sun is 0.0. That's what they say. They claim. And all the warming since 1850 is now because of the greenhouse gases. So 100% of the warming is greenhouse gases, the sun is 0.0. They still use models that are oversensitive,
They use high-end scenarios that are completely unrealistic. They ignore good news, like the lack of trends in extremes, especially hurricanes and floods, and the spectacular decline in weather-related deaths. IPCC made a big error by ignoring close to all the literature on disaster losses, and this is still for me, this was really incredible. I wrote a chapter about that in the book, and it's really incredible. So what did we do after we? Oh yeah, I first tell a small anecdote before I start. So when the book was ready, I thought, okay, this is really important what we found, because I told you about this Himalaya Gate in 2010. Himalaya Gate was like a minor error, you know. It was a stupid error, but it was not a very fundamental error, you know. But nevertheless, the Inter-Academy Council started this review of the IPCC. Now we found an error about these disaster losses, plain cherry-picking by the IPCC on one of the key topics. Disaster losses is one of the key topics. And they totally, well, the report is totally flawed on that. So I drafted a press release. And I phoned our national press agency. In Holland it's called ANP. And I phoned them and I said, I have a press release and I want to distribute it internationally because it's very important. I want the whole world to know about this book, this report. And the guy of the press agency said, okay, that's really interesting. You have to pay 8,000 euros to distribute it. And then they will send it to Reuters, AP, AFP, all the international press agencies. I said, 8,000 euros, I'm a small foundation, that's too much. So we negotiated and then, okay, I had to pay 3,000 euros and they would distribute it to 3,000 journalists around the world. I sent him the press release. The title of the press release was Clintel Foundation documents serious errors and biases in the IPCC report. I sent it to the press agency. Half an hour later, they called me and I said, no way, we are not going to distribute it. So they didn't want the 3,000 euros, they didn't want the money. And I said, okay, so your compliance department don't want to do it, but I said, okay, we worked on this book for 2 years. How can people in your department decide in 5 minutes that what we claim is wrong? You know, that's completely crazy. But even a press agency doesn't dare to distribute it because they are afraid for the negative image that they could have because of that. So what happened with the book? Nothing. Complete media silence. Nobody wrote about it. But we sent a letter. Guus Berghout sent a letter to the IPCC. And one of the things we say is that the IPCC commissions a team with representation from Clintel and other independent persons not involved in IPCC, like Roger Buki, to review whether the IPCC has fully implemented and followed the reforms recommended by the 2010 IAC review and whether more reforms are needed. Well, of course, the IPCC completely ignored our letter. They said we have an error protocol. If you think we have an error, please fill in the protocol. And that's it, you know. So that's very problematic. And my final conclusion is that the IPCC should reform or should be dismantled. But of course that's my personal opinion, and nobody cares. I mean, the media doesn't care, the politicians don't care so far, and so it's very hard to get this critique across. And I'm really open-minded how we could change it. This is not easy. I'm dealing with this for 20 years now, and you're really fighting. I compare David against Goliath. You know, it's really like that. And I think that's about it. I have some copies, not too many. You can buy a copy if you like. I have a few in German, if you prefer German above English, and some in English. And yeah, I thank you very much for your patience because I talked so long. And of course, I'm available for